Imagine you've promised to pick your sister up at 11 o'clock and take her to the airport. It's 10:30. You're driving to your sister's house, and just in front of you, there's a horrible accident. A train hits a school bus, or somebody loses control of their car and runs up onto a crowded sidewalk, and you happen to be a well-qualified trauma surgeon. What should you do? The way I describe the situation, I suspect most people will say that you stay and help the accident victims. The question is, can virtue theory handle this type of case? What's the problem here? The problem is that a virtuous agent doesn't break a promise. Keeping one's promises, being true to one's word, is a virtue. A virtuous person also helps those in need. A virtuous person who is well qualified to help in an emergency, such as this traffic accident, would do so. So virtue theory, it seems, demands that you do both, but you can't. To keep your promise, you have to leave the accident victims. To help the accident victims, you have to break your promise. Under virtue theory, what do you do? One potential solution is to say that the greatest virtue wins. The argument here is that it's not the case that all virtues have equal merit. The virtue of being true to one's word is great, but situations come up where keeping one's word has to give way to other greater concerns. The greater virtue of helping those in need outweighs the lesser virtue of keeping a promise. But is this true? Let's try a different situation. The traffic accident in this case is that of a slow-moving car that hits a child on a bicycle. You watch as the child stands, but the child does limp badly. Meanwhile, your sister is trying to catch a flight for a potentially career-making interview. This is a position that she has always wanted. She's asked you to give her a ride precisely because she doesn't want to trust her career to a paid driver who might not be reliable. Is it still the case that the virtue of helping others outweighs the virtue of keeping a promise? Now imagine, if you will, that you're certain that your sister will not get the position that she seeks. So your sister isn't ultimately going to benefit from you keeping your promise. It's simply a matter that you promised. As we alter the story to make the traffic accident less and less severe and make the promise more and more significant, there seems to be a point at which there's a switch. The obligation goes from helping the accident victims to keeping the promise. When we're talking about a severe accident and a rather trivial promise, the virtuous person will help the accident victims. But when it's a rather trivial accident and a significant promise, the virtuous person ignores the accident and keeps the promise. Neither virtue always wins. How does virtue theory handle this set of observations? The potential answer comes from W.D. Ross in the book The Right and the Good. But a caveat is required. Ross is not a virtue theorist, and he did not make this suggestion as a way of defending virtue theory from this concern. Ross was a deontologist and was concerned with the problem of rescuing deontology from a similar objection. Deontology says that the right act is the act that is in keeping with the correct moral principles. Among these correct moral principles, there's this duty to keep promises, and there's a duty to help those in need. The deontologist would conceive of this as a case of conflicting principles rather than a case of conflicting virtues. Ross answered the question of what to do when two principles conflict, as in the case of a person acting under an obligation to keep a promise when one comes upon an accident. Ross writes the following, quote, "If I have promised to meet a friend at a particular time for some trivial purpose, I should certainly think myself justified in breaking my engagement if by doing so I could prevent a serious accident or bring relief to the victims of one." End quote. To solve this problem, Ross argues that the two duties are what he called prima facie duties. There's a prima facie duty to keep promises and a prima facie duty to aid those in need. By a prima facie duty, Ross means that this duty has weight in considering one's overall duty. What one does is compare the weights of each duty in this circumstance. One's all things considered duty, or duty proper, or actual duty, Ross uses all of these terms, depends on the weighing of these prima facie duties. We can imagine these as actual weights. In Ross's example, we have a trivial promise. A trivial promise has a small weight. On the other hand, there's a much more serious weight of the obligation to aid the accident victims. The weight of these obligations depends on the facts of the matter. It depends on the fact that the promise is trivial, like meeting somebody for lunch, and one's ability to help the accident victims is great. The greater duty outweighs the lesser duty. It's important to note that the lesser duty remains. It doesn't vanish. You're still under an obligation to keep your promise. To see this, let's assume that you're helping the accident victims and it turns out that a medical convention is being held nearby and a couple of dozen doctors show up to help. The fact that you're still under an obligation to keep your promise is shown by the fact that if you're no longer needed here and you can still keep your promise, then you have an obligation to do so. The obligation doesn't vanish the instant it becomes outweighed and then return the instant that the weight disappears. It persists throughout, motivating the virtuous person to find some way to do both. But in the case where keeping the promise is far from trivial, it's a promise to a number of people who have something significant at stake, and the accident is relatively minor, cuts and scrapes and maybe a broken bone, and there are others who are well qualified to give assistance, then the obligation to keep a promise outweighs the obligation to provide a little aid to some accident victims. Now, this invites a question. Why not think of this conflict in consequentialist terms? Perform the act that produces the greatest good for the greatest number. But Ross argues that this doesn't make sense of the way that we actually handle moral questions. Ross writes, "It is more important that our theory fit the facts than that it is simple." So then, what is it that doesn't fit the fact? Well, for one thing, the consequentialist would have to consider all consequences in making a decision. Assuming that the promise was to meet one's sister for lunch, when determining the best consequences, the consequentialist would have to consider such things as the benefit to the restaurant of having a customer, and the benefit of a tip to the server. These are among the consequences of keeping one's promise, but they're not a part of one's duty to keep the promise. Only the consequences to the promisee are significant. So when it comes to fitting the facts, Ross argues that a system of prima facie duties does a better job than a system of best consequences. What does this have to do with virtue theory? Well, Ross's system of prima facie duties leaves a lot of questions unanswered. What are these duties? How do they get their weight? How do we even know that they exist? Now, consider these duties to be, instead, character traits. There's a disposition to keep promises, which may be understood as a desire to keep promises or an aversion to breaking promises. And there's a desire to aid those in need or an aversion to leaving them to suffer. There is no great difficulty in understanding what a learned disposition to favor acting or not acting in certain ways is. They are features of the mind brain that influence behavior, and they can be learned. Society can organize itself in ways so as to promote or encourage some of these traits and discourage others, in part by calling those to be encouraged virtues and those to be discouraged vices. Desires and aversions have a certain strength, something that we may conceive of as having weight, that varies with the facts. With respect to the aversion to pain, for example, we're not just talking about either having or not having pain. There's a stronger reason to avoid a severe and long-term pain than to avoid a weak pain that lasts only a few moments. In a virtuous person, the strength of the drive to keep a promise depends on the significance of what was promised. And how do we know of the existence of these desires and aversions? Well, by observing behavior. We postulate desires and aversions as ways of explaining why people do what they do. For example, why are you watching and listening to this lecture? Whatever answer you give, your answer will identify some set of goals that exists in you as desires, things that you want, and a set of beliefs that relate the act of watching this lecture to those goals. There's one last question to address here. What would make one of these dispositions a virtue or a vice? Here there are a number of theories. On the Aristotelian account, a virtue is a character trait that contributes to a good life for the one who has it. On the Humean count, a virtue is a trait that, among other things, is useful to others. This is what gives others a reason to promote or nurture that trait in their society, whereas a vice tends to motivate behaviors that's harmful to others. There are also objective list theories that say that it's a simple fact of some traits that they are intrinsically good and others are intrinsically bad. To sum up, the question we sought to answer here is whether virtue theory could provide an account of what to do if one finds oneself in a situation where two or more virtues conflict, recommending different actions. The answer is do the same thing that you would do when your desires conflict, when a desire to go out with one's friends conflicts with a desire to study. One weighs them and goes with the option with the greater weight. Only in the case of performing the right action, it's not our own desires and aversions that we weigh. It's the desires and aversions of the virtuous person. What would the virtuous person want to do in these circumstances?